Imagine you could influence regions across the globe, people of different cultures and languages on the same ideological issues. From one central point of execution, with the masses not knowing they are part of a larger, overriding strategy far beyond their concerns. When people believe what speaks to them doesn't do that at all, but they think it does. Evidence of such operations have been known since 2011, thanks to the anonymous raid on HB Gary Federal. The industry has had robust growth since, involving corporations, nation states, and political parties, among others. It is called Psychometrics. Neal Rauhauser, author of the white paper that led to 20 U.S. House representative offices calling for hearings on these activities, has been there every step of the way. A veteran of Project VIGILANT, contributor to the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium, and now with Liberty STRATCOM. He has been witness to and participant in many notable episodes in the past decade. James Patrick, founder of Liberty STRATCOM, was an intelligence officer with Scotland Yard before becoming disillusioned with law enforcement and starting his career in investigative journalism. A journey of discovery lasting years led him to find interference in the UK Brexit campaign, the US 2016 elections, and other society altering events around the world, exposing the existence of sophisticated disinformation campaigns. Alternative War is the highly detailed book written by James, accounting his descent into the psychometrics industry and the alternate realities it creates. On the third annual Live on the Five, the View Up Here welcomes Neal and James to discuss, inform, and warn citizens of what is happening and how we are all driving it with our own activity being used against us.
Well, welcome to this very special Live on the 5 episode. I have with me tonight Mr. Neal Rauhauser. Welcome back to the show once more, Neal.
No, thank you. Good to be back.
And I also have Mr. James Patrick, author of Alternative War, a very interesting path. It's an amazing timeline of your journey, and it's been very interesting. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you for having me.
Now, when we look at social media today, people on it, when I came to Twitter in late 2010, Neal, I'm sure you were here before me. James, I'm sure you've been on social media for a long time. For the reasonable past for most people, especially in the Western world, we can't imagine day-to-day life without it. That's how pervasive it's become. It seems like a very long road from back then to where we are today, but then in some ways it doesn't seem that long at all. With the way social media has been changed, has been used, directed, weaponized, should we be surprised? Was this possible way back then? It just took a while for everybody to catch up?
I think for me, the eye-opening experience started in 2006. I was in law enforcement. I was an intelligence officer in a police force, and it was around that time that Facebook had started to explode and become a workload all of its own. And we started to use it as a tool. If you bear in mind that our data systems in policing were still quite separated and dysfunctional at that point in time, so we still had manual fingerprints, so we didn't have live scan database. We didn't necessarily have photographs on system. And all of a sudden there's this tool on the internet that we can click onto, and back then it was people's Bebo pages and MySpace pages, and for the first time we were seeing gangs and gang members posting pictures of themselves, which we otherwise would never have got access to, and pictures of themselves with weapons. So between the 2006-2008 period, I was actually at the forefront in my force, and as I understand it nationally, in starting to use these social media tools to complement our internal data sets and intelligence systems and build new pictures of people. So rather than relying on what we could glean as police officers through traditional human intelligence sources or other information, we were able to proactively go out and get information from what people were leaving as effectively online fingerprints. And because of that, we were able to get warrants for firearms and all kinds of stuff. And there was such a rapid change during that period. It was huge, and it was an explosion, and then along came Twitter. But I think the key point, sort of simultaneously to this, there were defense contractors who recognized the potential in the same thing. So one of the key sort of WikiLeaks back in the 2010-11 period relates to HB Gary, which is a US contractor. And part of what leaked, I think that was sparked by WikiLeaks and Anonymous getting into what seems on the face of it to be an almost personal dispute with this guy who worked at HB Gary. But part of what was published was these internal presentations that had gone between Gary and Palantir, and they were about value of social media moving forwards and how they would be able to profile and how they would be able to find target information and how they would be able to effectively seek people and organizations out to take them down or manipulate people around them. And as things have then moved forward, I joined Twitter in 2012, and I remember distinctly that the problems we had were porn bots with manga avatars, and they all had like those crazy long names which were made up of letters at the time.
Yeah.
As opposed to these new ones now, which have like the 8 digits at the end of them. And I think that sort of ties into where Neal sort of first saw the explosion of internet traffic, which started to give us the signals that these preparations for the weaponization and manipulation of people and target identification had begun to come to fruition.
Yeah, it's I guess I have a sort of U.S. electoral cycle view on all of this. I mean, you have the 2004 election with what happened with Kerry, and very much the netroots and the blog explosion of 2006 was the response. Obama's election in 2008, and then the response in 2009 with the wind up to that particular midterm and the census with all of the attention from the Tea Party. And it's continued along that path. I got on Twitter, I think the account that I use most of the time now is from August of 2008. And in March of 2009, I wrote an article and I basically predicted that social media was going to have a federated future, that we would see something like Mastodon very quickly. And I didn't count on the amount of pressure advertisers can apply and the ad revenue-based model that holds things together. My first conflicted election was in 2009. The month I wrote that article was the month that Chet Huber approached me and wanted to get something going, which became Project Vigilant. And the first thing out of the gate was the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009. And in 2010, what we saw was, the conflict with WikiLeaks. It started with Operation Titstorm and the censorship in Australia, and then kind of segued into WikiLeaks, and then from there into Arab Spring, and then into Occupy. And I think the beginnings of that were very much grassroots. I think that was very much, 4chan and Something Awful and Encyclopedia Dramatica and just the troll watering holes, which are still the source of innovation in that area. First time I saw something that I can definitely say was a nation state at work was the summer of 2012. And I friended 3,200 people on Facebook, almost all of whom had a Guy Fawkes mask or something else, obviously from that universe. And I happened to log back in 6 or 8 months ago, and the 2,400 survivors, well over half of them are now rural white Christian conservatives.
Interesting.
Yeah, quite a change. So I have that particular, and I didn't understand it at the time, but what I do remember is that from the spring of 2012, when there were still grassroots leaders, when someone could make something happen and, just with a couple people set something in motion, that by that summer, it was like trying to stand up in a tropical storm force wind. Things were going a certain direction and there was no interdicting it. So very much like the LulzSec blowout, where you had the 50 days of constant activity, which is just not consistent for how a group like that would behave.
Yeah.
The wind came up in the summer of 2012, and it's never gone back down.
And I don't think you would necessarily agree that it's still the grassroots people power that's kept it that way, is it? Isn't that what's really changed here? That it's no longer organic?
I think this is one of the biggest things which people have not really gripped yet. Part of the problem, and we need to sort of acknowledge this up front, is Neal touched on this ad revenue model that social media platforms have. Now, like with Twitter, with Facebook, their ability to sell their platform and make their money is based on the number of users. It's nothing more complicated than that. So actually, it's in their best interest to have as many users as possible, which is why there are so many fake users and why efforts to limit the number of fake or spurious users are so limited. So actually, knowing and understanding that about the entire business ecosystem of social media platforms is really, really crucial. Now, if you then look at the climate as it's changed, in the UK in 2012, around the time that Neal was seeing this big explosion and the introduction of non-native narratives, the UK was really, really simplistic still. I mean, our trolls were just fundamentally wankers on the internet. And it wasn't until 2016, late 2015, that we saw a similar kind of impact. And what made it so identifiable during the Brexit period, which stands out here and made it much easier to see that there was a significant change, was the introduction of non-native language and terms and stuff which doesn't fit within our political system and traditional way of speaking about politics. So terms like libtard and constant use of liberals, which started springing up from these accounts, which were all very patriotic, and it was all poppies and Union Jacks and stuff.
Yeah.
It's not native. It's not native to our domestic argument. So it became really identifiable, and actually the quantity of it, as it then became a flood, you could see by the 23rd of June that there were native people who'd adopted these terms, like snowflakes and stuff like that. So there's actually a really brief capsule period in time, which if you were to look back at Twitter, you can specifically identify when it happened, and it makes it much, much easier to pick out the accounts. And this is why there's such a problem that we have at the moment. Twitter have sort of said, look, we've only found 3,800 foreign accounts, and there's only like these few million tweets, and that's it. And everyone's fixated on it, and they've gone, oh well, that's that then. It's not in Twitter's interest, because of their business model, to reveal a true picture. That's point number one, which people need to get their head around. And then point number two, I don't think anyone has actually bothered to go back and look at the non-native language properly. And if they were to do that, you would have a much more rounded picture of when this happened in the UK, and you could then back compare those accounts to the US accounts. And I dare say if you took them all the way back to 2012, you would find a crossover period. And this is before we even get into there's this really important concept of hostile nation states, but how hostile nation states use their own assets, which are their attached assets, and then detached assets and deniable assets, which are very, very often locally based. And this is where things become a real.
I agree. I think that's a huge point, that the ability of bigger and bigger interests that get into the development of specific agendas or opinions or changing the way the wind blows, these people can vertically integrate. And as long as they get people who are willing to drink their Kool-Aid, they don't really have to worry about too much once the training manual gets distributed. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely bang on. And one of the other interesting things which has come out in terms of academic study, and it's only relatively recent that this was put out. I think it was late summer. Some bright sparks have finally acknowledged that you actually don't need to influence a whole population or a whole group in order to change behavior. Actually, you need to influence about 25% or less of it. So once this training manual is rolled out and people take up on it, you only need to target very, very small groups of people and subgroups of people to change behavior. So it's a complete mess, and the interests at the top level sort of cross over so neatly, and they interact in different ways. Because, say, like for example, we were to talk about Russia, and then the American conservative right. It's not just dark money, which is the crossover. It's not just far right ideology, which is the crossover. You've got these weird interactions with the church. You've got these strange interactions with interest groups like the National Rifle Association and stuff as well. So there's actually a lot more to it. So for every one malicious nation state actor account, you can actually pretty much bet and identify that there are going to be hundreds more within subgroups that are operating to the same patterns.
So I was just going to jump in and say, Neal, don't you think from your side of things, from analytic point of view, that's absolute proof that these things are by no means grassroots generated anymore?
I think that there is a short film on YouTube that was written by artificial intelligence, and it's an incoherent fever dream, and there's a little song that goes with it, and it's I think Sunsphere is the name of it. So we're not at a point yet where machines generate new speech. We are seeing deep dream, images that are influential, but we're not yet at a point where machines are doing that. So the presence of the machines is automation, and like a bullhorn, pick who to amplify. And they're constantly present and constantly pushing. And that gives people who otherwise, like the lulzsec rampage, people who would have a hit and then they wouldn't do anything for a while. It gives them the ability to keep pushing. That constant pressure that I described that, I first experienced in 2012. James cited a number of, 25% of a population needed to change behavior. I think the Roman Empire fell due to a 3 to 5%, barbarian invasion. And so it doesn't take a lot if you've got a pivot point. The same thing with our presidential election in 2016, 3 states, 80,000 votes total. If you can see where you need to press to make things happen, it doesn't take all that much force.
I think there's another key psychological aspect of people, which has come up time and again within this, is that you don't even necessarily need to positively influence behavior. And in fact, it's easier to suppress behavior within groups, which is part and parcel of actual warfare. It's about suppression of resistance. So if you can dissuade people from voting, it's actually easier than persuading them to vote against their own interests or vote in a different way. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen that within the activity online.
I think, yeah, I agree with that, because what I've noticed just, as Joe Blow internet user at whatever level in the last, say, 2 to 3 years, Neal, when you talk about back in the Tea Party days, it was unidirectional from them. They had a point, and they were going to scream it in your face, even if you closed the door. They wouldn't stop screaming. But what I saw change is it seems to me that there's such a premium put on just complete confusion now. It seems to me that the mission has changed from selling a product to telling you that the entire market can't be trusted. But we can.
Well, that's very much a Russian maneuver, that the objective is that, at first they're selling this angle or that, but the goal is to get people to the point where they just say, fuck it. There's too much going on. I don't understand. They want people to not trust anything. And then that depresses turnout. And it enables a manipulator if you've got a smaller set to work with.
Yeah, I mean, chaos is king. If you look at the way that America was really sort of cleverly subdivided, say you look at Trump's base and call that about 40%, then you look at the other aspects of it, which would be the Bernie Sanders group and the Green Party candidate, I can't remember.
Jill Stein.
That's it. And then you have different subgroups and different interest groups, and then you have like a hardcore of Democrats who would vote Democrats, do or die. It's really, really easy to create chaos within those groups if you peg them off. If you take that 40% out of the equation and just think, well, fundamentally, they would vote for a dog turd if we put him up as a GOP candidate. That's safe, so you don't need to mess with that too much. You can keep them confused. You can say that everything else is fake news, and you have that trust barrier. So they're only ever going to listen to the president. They're only ever going to listen to GOP candidates. Everybody else is fair game within that, because say you had special interest groups, say Black Lives Matter, for example, they would form a portion of the group that you wanted to disrupt. And if you can set all of these different subgroups against each other and make them distrust each other, then what you end up with is a 40% solid vote, which are going to go against their own interests all day, every day. You end up with like a 20% hardcore of people who are continue with their vote, come what may. And then you've got this big wedge of people producing of a big enough counter vote. So yeah, that's how it works.
Well, this playing field, which is global and which is now highly accessible by a vast majority of the world's population, and it's developing at such a high rate, are there any rules at all in this game?
I think that the answer to that is that, no. There's no legislation. There's no, there is no Geneva Convention on use of social media. We've got the Talon Manual regarding cyber conflict, which most people don't know about, and I don't think gets adhered to. So the rules are what are fundamental. The boundaries of the space are what humans will do and what you can make systems do.
So what you're saying is the rules are merely the limits.
Yeah, the shape of the envelope controls what's going on right now.
Okay.
And we've not caught up in legislation or enforcement.
No, I think one of the sort of the key things is that we were safe for a number of years because warfare was constrained. You could fairly well regulate that, which is what the arms treaties that Trump's just pulled out of were fundamentally all about. What we've ended up with because of the internet and because of social media is a borderless frontier world, which is very much like the Wild West. But because you suddenly have no international boundaries, it means that not only are we dealing with outdated use of force sort of legal structures from the UN to NATO, even despite the adaptation of the Article 5 for cyber warfare at the 2014 Wales Summit, you have a situation where different countries with different domestic legislation and different electoral protections and different free speech rights are suddenly stripped away, and those domestic legislation elements and regulations and enforcement bodies are all rendered completely useless.
Mm-hmm.
And me and Neil were talking about this the other night, because we were talking about Twitter and its sort of Wild West status. And one of the key things which came up is that over in the States, you've obviously got the First Amendment. Over here, it's slightly different because there are rules on what you can say. On Twitter, that boundary doesn't exist. So there's a constant crossover. And in terms of rules of engagement from the parties that are using social media in a weaponized format, you have like Russia are the absolute daddy at this. And the simple truth is they do not give a fuck. They don't give a fuck. People could put in whatever domestic legislation they wanted to, but as long as it doesn't interact at an international level, it's going to be completely ineffective.
Is that somehow one of the side effects of the great orgy in the last 30 years of international trade deals and WTO and everything else that has led to the idea that a borderless world is a great thing?
You know, there are a couple things at work there. You have the globe shrinking. As we've gotten better at transportation, we've had more liquid fuels. You can get anywhere now, and that wasn't the case 50 or 60 years ago. And communications-wise, the fiber has snaked everywhere. The bandwidth has gone up, and things have changed dramatically in the 35 years since I first sat down in front of an internet-connected computer. And the condition of the world, the Doha trade negotiations broke down, and they broke down due to the complexity and the rapidity of change, and we're left with a lot of bilateral trade agreements. And the fundamental nature of the internet is not Westphalian. The nature of this whole notion of Westphalian sovereignty is not mapped. The internet was built by DARPA, and it was intended to stay running in the event of a nuclear attack. So this is an article I write about once a year. The native entities for the internet. You have 5 regional internet registries: ARIN, RIPE, AFRINIC, LACNIC, and APNIC. Did I get that right? And those are the entities that hand out IP address prefixes and autonomous system numbers. And if you have a little bit of money and a place with electrical power and a phone company nearby, you can connect. And then within those regional internet registries, there are autonomous systems. And with one or more IP address prefixes. And that's how things are laid out. And so if you have a problem, like if you have a Bulgarian spearfishing a bunch of stuff that's being run by a grifter in Florida, this is the most recent example I can think of that I've worked on, whose jurisdiction is that in? Because it's not state on state violence, and it wasn't large enough or long enough running to qualify for the European Cybercrime Center or the DOJ to get interested. And the answer in a lot of cases, there's the notion of jurisdiction is bound to geographic location, and the internet breaks that entirely. And a lot of times it's nobody, that's who's responsible. Nobody. Nanog keeps the packets flowing, and and there are other network operations groups, but at a low level they're responsible for that. There are DNS cabals that keep the name services up, and a few other things that run that way. And it is very anarchic otherwise. You can do as you will, and getting filtered takes, you have to be a hardcore shithead for a long time to get filtered.
Do you know one of the interesting things as you've been talking then, Neal, is I've, by virtue of the jobs I've had and the people that I speak to, spent a lot of time speaking to policymakers, and that would be politicians and other such people here in the UK and over in the EU. And 99.9% of what you've just said would go completely over their head. And part of the reason, Glenn, you originally asked if it was because of trade and stuff that all this had happened. The reality is that the world has moved on and advanced so quickly into a language that the people who are setting the international agendas don't understand, that actually, if you were to present a speech like Neal has just given to them, they would just say yeah. They wouldn't know what they were saying yeah to, but they would just say yeah because they don't have the technical expertise. And I think one of the other key things about technology in its sort of brutal development is that it's been surrounded by so much bullshit and technical language that general populations can't understand, that lawmakers and policymakers can't understand. It's not really a great surprise that we've ended up where we are in the frontier West with a bunch of cowboys running amok. Because how do you legislate and how do you defend against something that you fundamentally do not understand? And that's part of where the big problem comes in, because it's going to be a case of translating. So there are going to be deeply technical people like Neal who are going to be part of the solution, and there are going to be people like me who can get most of it, and I don't profess to understand all of it because you can't, can you? But there needs to be a translation point, and there actually needs to be a meeting of the sort of the tripartite axis of the technical, the human, and the policymakers in order to get things brought up to speed. And in terms of policy changes, it wouldn't be that difficult to combat all of this, and it wouldn't be that difficult, say, for me and Neal to go and have these conversations with the EU, who are currently in a flap about next year's elections, not just the European Commission elections, but the actual international elections and stuff. But until people start having the conversations, which start with the acknowledgement that people haven't got a fucking clue what's going on and what it all means, I think we're going to be stuffed.
We have a generational issue. I mean, I'm, one of the older of Generation X. And so I first sat down in front of an Apple II when I was, still in grade school. And the baby boomers who still dominate policymaking didn't have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, they missed it until the 50-somethings get to be in their later 50s and end up in those positions. It's as notable as the people who grew up riding horses suddenly having to adapt to automobiles.
But yet, the ones who grew up on horses are the ones deciding on funding for roads. That's what you're saying. But I mean, when you describe the inability to establish jurisdiction, because this is a global thing, that was the great thing about the internet. You could talk to anybody, anywhere. Well, the other side of that is, I guess, that you can't go after anybody, anywhere. It's not a reciprocal thing, but isn't this what organizations like Five Eyes pioneered? I mean, didn't we hit a point where it went from domestic agencies for nation states getting away with saying they were defending? When did that point come where they stopped defending and went on the offense?
It's the whole Five Eyes thing. Even NATO at the minute is a bit of a mess. NATO seem to have a better grip on all of this than most other people. But if you were to look at the British intelligence services, even with all the capacity that they have, all of the controversy around GCHQ and the Snowden revelations and everything like that, what they've been doing, they've very recently got into trouble for hacking Belgium's telecom, which basically means that they were spying on the European Parliament, and they are currently our closest allies. So there's a whole unraveling mess around the operations of the security services, which is going to significantly disrupt its capability to operate effectively in the international plane. And then you also have Britain committing what is fundamentally national suicide with Brexit, and then reducing its local alliances and partnerships. And actually some of the rhetoric which has been coming out recently is very warlike, which is deeply disturbing, because the Brits for years have relied on European neighbours and partners in order to be eyes and ears. And in fact, if you look at one of the key jurisdictional things which is going to change with Brexit, would be something like the European arrest warrant. We rely on that to say that we have a cross-border problem where there is, as Neal mentioned, Bulgaria. Say there is a problem in Bulgaria, it's European arrest warrant, boom, we've got that guy, we can get them in from anywhere in Europe, that's not a problem. We're actually leaving that arrangement and we haven't got anything to replace it with. So here you have the head of the National Crime Agency, which is the British equivalent of the FBI, saying that we aren't going to be able to operate, our intelligence sharing is going to die off. And then there are question marks over how Five Eyes can move forwards in its current format. And then there's going to be a restructuring of NATO, which, if you read the lay of the land, is going to be much more European-centric as those nations become closer and closer together. So there are going to be some significant shifts, and all of this impacts the jurisdictional stuff, because I think Julian Assange is a really good example of this. It's just not that easy to go and nick someone for hacking offences internationally. There are too many places to hide, too many ways that you can do it, and then ultimately what are going to be too many arguments about what is proportionate extradition and stuff like that. So we're in a complete international mess, and it's almost a paralysis of the mechanisms which address the jurisdictional issues.
I want to chime in on the meat versus machine problem before we go skating off to another topic. There is an enormous amount of hardware in that data center in Magna, Utah, and GCHQ has their stuff. But who understands what they're looking at? That's a problem. Right now, we have, we internally have the capability to, if I fired up everything at once, we can record the full content of, 5,000 Twitter accounts an hour. But what good is it? Because who can pick through all of that? Even with the capabilities we have, with the automation, with the field experience, a lot of times that hardware is sitting idle because we don't have the brain power constantly. Nice. And this is something that has come up in, when the NSA first got busy in 2009. And, they were having the FBI out interviewing pizza drivers because of cash deposits and other things that it tripped the system, but it wasn't a problem. I'm seeing the same dynamic shaping up with artificial intelligence. It's a source of support if you know how to use it, if you employ it sensibly, but it's not going to be the same as manufacturing automation, which is the kind of the big worry now, because humans will innovate around that kind of stuff.
Will people always stay ahead of the ball where AI is concerned? Doesn't there have to be a tipping point there? But we're not there yet.
This is, we would be veering off into an intense philosophical discussion. And, as someone who spends time examining networks at scale, you have humans embedded in this Twitter thing, and they communicate, tweets, which are packets of information, and they can have threaded conversations, the neurons that wire together. Yeah. And there are likes, and That's a network. That looks like a neural network. And there are cyborgs out there. There are people who are consistently supported by technology that expands their reach. You know, we've had some notable examples. Junaid Hussain, notable example of a person who, on the output side, dramatically expanded his reach. Andrew Arnheimer, the same thing with Daily Stormer. Tremendous outbound capacity there. And, you know, the stuff that JP and I are working on, it's more observational. It's more inbound. It puts us in a position to do things that most people cannot. That is like the internet was from 93 to about 2000. There are these brilliant flashes of, hey, look what those people can do. But it's going to get democratized one way or another.
I don't see how it can't. That's the thing. I think an interesting side note on the AI thing. There's a guy at Manchester University this week who is launching his supercomputer, which is designed to replicate a human brain, and they've attached a robot to it so that they can try and make robotics more efficient by replicating the relative low power use of humans. And I kind of dread to think what the future would hold in terms of AI if they go down that route, because if it learns in the same way as humans, we're fundamentally not very nice. so I think AI, in terms of its use in social media, it's got limited application without human input. I think in other areas, there's probably going to be some kind of, as Neal said, deeply philosophical conversation that needs to be had about what we do in the future, because it's just got the potential to go incredibly wrong.
Now, as Neal said, all this data is being collected and stored. And the question, I agree, is, you know, we've seen the last 5 years, maybe a little more. We collect everything. Why? Because we can. No, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't sound like it's very problem solving. It's just garbage massing, but fine. But the issue is, with people on social media, I think there has to be a better understanding of their quote-unquote profile. And I mean, some of the numbers out there, I mean, I was reading something that was put out by Cambridge Analytica, and they said they could gather around 5,000 data points on a profile. Isn't that more than people know about themselves on a conscious level?
I think this sort of goes back to the Kaczynski research. This is the guy who sort of sparked all this by doing online surveys. And they worked out with a certain number of data points just based on your social media profiles that they could actually predict your behavior and effectively know you better than you knew yourself based on the ocean psychological profiles. The problem that we've got with data and cross-platform usage in social media is there's all the stuff that we're offering up. So if you look at a person, actually, it's fairly easy to see from Facebook what they're interested in. If they're completely family oriented, if they are above average intelligence below, there's nothing that you can't pick up. There's their buyer habits. And you get all the linked advertising stuff as well, which kind of feeds back in from what they buy on Amazon. So that reflects in what adverts they see, so you can drive behavior. Twitter's much more conversational by its nature. So it's much more about how immediately and how emotional people are. And that's the kind of stuff you can gather from there. Then on the underside of that, you have hacked data and data which people don't know is being gathered. So if you look at like the big LinkedIn hacks or the big Yahoo hacks, actually all of that stuff, and that is your receipts, purchase histories, places you've stayed, stuff like that, it's all up there on offer, your geolocations, everything. If you know enough about a person that you can cross-match potentially their hacked email data with their Facebook account, with their Twitter profile, with their Instagram, then you can build a picture of a person so well-rounded that even with a basic level of psychological understanding, you would be able to know that person, know what drives them, and know how to drive not necessarily their decision making, because you can never really do that in a person. I've been in enough emergency situations to know that people are wildly unpredictable, but you know how to push their buttons. And that is something which is fundamental to policing. It's fundamental to warfare. You have to be able to do the button push, which is going to drive a reaction. And then you bring in the secondary angle to it, which is once you have a reaction commencing, it's how you steer and respond to that reaction, which is where you feed back into signal amplification of bots and trolls. And this is why we've seen these crazy developments in the last 2 years where news stories absolutely explode and people react in wild ways, and then there's more to it, and then there's more to it, and then there's more to it, and behavior is eventually steered to a conclusion. And that conclusion is always that people are either turned off to a subject or completely believe it. But yeah, those data profiles, 5,000 data points, you could do that easily.
Wow.
And I think in the Canadian Parliament, the stuff with AIQ that's been coming out as well is pretty fundamental to this, because Facebook lost 87 million user account details, was it? Just
81 million.
81 million, just through having their API data open. And that's gone. That's out there now. And the thing is, it can't be taken back. It can be built upon, but it can't be taken back. There's a guy in New York who I've spoken to, who I've followed his story all along, and we've talked to each other throughout the whole alternative war process. David Carroll is a professor. He's been instrumental in the Information Commissioner's Office case against Cambridge Analytica here in the UK about retention of data and improperly refusing to hand it over and all this kind of stuff. And it's just from a human practical sort of side of it, what he has been able to reveal about what they hold on him shows that there are multiple databases feeding in, and that actually once that data is in someone's possession, they know who he is. All they need to do is look at his Twitter feed, and they can keep him up to date in perpetuity. There's this concept, this digital footprint. It's like we give away or have stolen a part of ourselves, and then it's forever existent in the digital world. And actually what we're doing by continuing to be there is we're filling the transparency in pixel by pixel until that picture is more and more complete. And that's not a process that can be reversed.
And it is a trick and a half to avoid that kind of activity. I bricked my last postpaid cell phone about 5 years ago and have never replaced it. My burner phone, which rotates periodically, I started turning off about 3 years ago. Started taking the battery out of 2 years ago. And starting at the beginning of this year, I am one of those rare people that I don't have a phone in my pocket when I go out. Unless I'm going out of town overnight, the phone is not with me. I'm looking at, as soon as JP started talking, I pulled up my firewall rule set here. All of the different profiling things that I block, it's anytime a new domain pops up, I go and I research it a little bit. And if it's something unexpected, a lot of times it's, driving customer engagement, this, that, or the other. So I'm a hole in the graph, intentionally so.
Yeah.
And you have to be a little bit obsessive and a little bit paranoid and skilled to make that happen. And most people are not going to put in the effort unless they have, an existential threat. They're not going to run clean. So that kind of data accumulation is going to keep happening. And we are seeing, socially, there have been some changes, like Facebook for teens on the decline. They like Snapchat. because it's in the moment and then it's gone, and you're not answering for what you said 2 years ago. And the disappearing messages. So we're here. We're on a call on Wire, so we're not being observed. And you can set Wire to burn messages. And there are now compliance issues with some of the new cryptocurrency setups because they don't have email. And financial compliance presumed that everything would be available in email. And there are a lot of those things that run purely on Slack. And that's a change.
And that's the Wild West, correct?
Yeah. It is. So the people who are aware are squirming around. But I think JP, what he's saying, that this is going out there and that it can't be taken back. I mean, it takes a long time to scrub your presence. Mm-hmm. I'm probably the poster child for having to deal with that. The level of pressure that I've been under the first week of July 2012, I walked out the door in DC. I didn't even tell my mom where I was going. And now here we are, a couple days away from the 2018 midterm. I still haven't told her. And I have moved a number of times since then. And, still have, some obsessive weirdos. And that's, part of the conflict. That's a conflict method that, you get these cranks that become attached to you. Yeah, so I should really get going on my book. I've published the first chapter over there at Liberty STRATCOM and really need to sit down and maybe finish up the rest of it between now and the end of the year.
I think you should really. I think this whole concept of removing digital presence and stuff like that. I mean, if with my background and the whistleblowing stuff and the fact that there have been articles about me in papers and all sorts, because my life has been just one long and interesting fuck up. It's going to be absolutely impossible for me to disentangle or disconnect from the world. So I'm kind of stuffed, and I'm a long way beyond being able to get a burner phone and doing it. And the thing is, I realise this and I understand it. People in general, and I speak to, so like at the moment, I've got 37,000-ish Twitter followers who have been sort of really hard earned. The portion of people that are on there that I would say are fully aware of the risks of their digital self and that are fully engaged with that probably number on hands, fingers.
Yep.
And that includes policymakers. This even includes journalists who write on this topic. This includes some of the best informed and up-to-date people out there. And part of the reason is that the last couple of years has been this barrage of not just actual change and technological change and things already moving forwards and the sort of the dips out and dips in and the way that things have progressed over to Slack and other things which people genuinely don't understand. I mean, if you speak to most people about blockchain, they still don't know what it is. There isn't this level of, some people would call it digital literacy, which is going to be absolutely crucial to unpicking the mess that we're in. But I don't even think that there is a way that you can start with that, because there's so much of ourselves out in the wild already that I don't think it ever can be taken back. It's going to be a huge problem. I mean, I sort of say there are two nuclear options for sort of dealing with the problem that we're in. One of them is to just acknowledge that perhaps we weren't ready for the internet, turn the whole thing off, delete it, and come back to it again when we've all stopped being complete dicks. Just because if you look at the way that America is divided, even Canada is seeing the same issues. The stuff that's going on in Europe, the stuff that's going on in Australia, everywhere. It's just this constant. It's like a digital blitz, and people don't know what's up, what's down, and to even try and get people to engage on the broader concept of personal data management at this moment in time, while the pace of change is ongoing, and we're getting like there's a new phone out every week, and there's a new piece of software out every week, and it's impossible. People can't take in the scale of change, the pace of change, the amount of information that they're sending out into the world. So it's actually pretty unfair to contemplate other options if I mean, it's almost like you've got to look at it like a situation of soldiers versus civilians. Neal would fall very much within the sort of soldier bracket because of his level of technical expertise, and soldiers are sufficiently trained to deal with a conflict situation. A lot of the people that are in the path of all this, they just aren't equipped for it. So actually, perhaps we do need to have a conversation about turning it all off. It's like an old joke from the comedy series The It Crowd over here. Have you tried turning it off and on again?
Yeah.
And perhaps we need to. I don't know. I think that's probably a bit deep, but that's kind of what I'm leaning more and more towards. The more people that I speak to, because some people are just too stupid to have Wi-Fi.
I support that assessment.
And you immediately had a top 5 list of names spring to mind, didn't you, Glenn? I bet there's another thing that's coming at us here, though, and that is, with climate change, with the risk, we've found this new level of liquid fuel availability at the cost of drinking water for a geological age. That's going to backlash on us. And we've already seen, with China, 93% of all the rare earth production, not the reserves, but what was being produced, is in China.
Yeah.
And with the volcano in Iceland, you see what happens, back in, was it 2010? You see what happens when our just-in-time inventory management becomes almost in time. And that turning off it's not something we would do willingly, but it's something that Mother Nature may subject us to.
I completely agree. I think in terms of just-in-time supply chain, Britain is going to become the world leader in showing how stupid it is to voluntarily switch it off, because the very, very sort of real Brexit risks in the no deal technical notices are that we are quite prepared on the 29th of March next year to turn the taps off for everything, without a further plan in place. But it's right that actually the Earth is going to do it for us at some point anyway. So all of this fancy technological crap that we filled our lives with is just going to be absolutely worthless. And there is the need, or the pressing need, for conversations about what the hell it is that we're playing at, because we've become such a group of consumers, partly based on privilege of the fact that we can have it, that is actually showing humanity up to be almost a bacterial infection on the planet rather than a bonus to it.
Individually, we show sparks of brilliance. Collectively, we are no wiser than the cyanobacteria that originally produced the oxygen atmosphere we now breathe and wipe themselves out in the process.
We will, however, make great food for trees.
That is correct. I would agree with that. Now, as you guys said about how next to impossible it is to remove your self from the internet, doesn't that just prove in this day and age the most valuable commodity on the face of the planet is data? Is it not? Because if you can use it to get people to buy a specific size of a product, what can politicians do with it? What can governments do with it? What can people like Alphabet and Amazon do with it? Is this becoming a war that is different than anything we've ever seen, because it's not a military against a military? This is everybody's in on this. Is that what makes it so different?
Yeah, if you sort of imagine it's like everyone in the world has been invited to a big game of Laser Quest and there are no teams. It's basically insanity, and that data is the most valuable thing in the world, because it's actually gotten to the point where it's able to control the financial markets and trades. So is even more valuable than money, because if you look, say for example, some of the insider trading allegations that have come out, and these are just at a really, really simple basic level around announcements on the Brexit vote being lost or won, and how there were jumps in the pound and short selling on the market. If by using people's personal data, you can drive them to vote in a certain direction, and you can use that data to drive polls in another direction, and you can use that data to drive currency in certain directions, knowing that the result is actually the opposite, then you have control over money. So actually in the pecking order, that data comes above currency. And for as long as human memory, currency has been king. And that's just simply not the case anymore.
Okay, now here's something that's not on the list, but I think this is what I'm hearing. Now, if you look back at, say, Vietnam, where it was for real, not just a slogan, they actually tried the hearts and minds thing.
Yeah.
Let's win them over. But as the Viet Cong proved, all it takes is a few among them that can make a big enough noise, and you'll never be able to sell it. But now with the internet, you can sell it. It doesn't matter if people are opposed. You can silence them and get louder yourself. Is that what has changed about this theater?
Really, yeah. I think what's happened is that we said earlier on about the breakdown of the domestic boundaries and domestic norms, really sort of crucial, because it was that which made that situation exist in Vietnam. You can't reach out to something with hearts and minds if it comes from an operationally different system, because we've now sort of transcended that, and we live in this, if you look at it as almost a layered system where this global borderless world sits at the very top, and that it's a downward facing pyramid, and the domestic stuff and then localized stuff sits way underneath that, then yeah, we've gone way beyond it, because the operating system is suddenly completely different. And the hearts and minds thing is something now which is just, you could win or lose it day to day, but you could win or lose it anywhere in the world as long as you focused right. If you look at the history of the stuff that Cambridge Analytica have done, for example, Kenya or Bermuda or anywhere else they've been, it doesn't matter where you go, you can play the same game and win again and again and again, because that level of domestic insulation has been removed. So everybody is being exposed to the same stuff. The one place which is still relatively well protected from it, at least for now, is China. And one of the things that people, I think, misunderstand about China is they're not necessarily interested in going out on the attack in terms of warfare and espionage. What they're interested in doing is absolute total defense. And the starting point for that is understanding what everybody else is doing, but also making sure that what everybody else is doing cannot have an impact at home. So if you look at the way that China tightly controls internet access and stuff like that, it shows you that not only are they aware of the problem, but they're aware of how to mitigate the problem.
Okay, so now, Neal, with the tools that are out there, is that possible? Or does it take a massive, massive effort? Or is it a matter of scale? Depending on what it is exactly you're looking to insulate, it can be done. I guess what I'm asking, because everybody has the same tool set, we know there are a lot of bad guys out there. Are there any good guys?
I don't know that you can use black and white language.
Okay.
Like good or bad. You know, there isn't. There's power and those who wield it. You know, where we are, the three of us, Westerners, you know, we have a certain socioeconomic position, we have a certain access to information, a certain ability to get others to listen to us. The question is, where are we going as a species? We stray very far off the policy path here, but we're basically facing an existential threat with what's going on with our climate and ocean acidification and so forth. And yet we have governments that, literally have institutionalized rectocranial inversions they're not going to do anything about it until they strangle. And that's the case with the Trump administration. Australia has been subject to that sort of thing. Because of the sale of coal to China. That's the driver there. Saudi Arabia has its view, and that's a couple layers above these sort of mechanisms that we're talking around.
What do you think, James? Are there good guys and bad guys or not?
Yeah, there are good guys. Yeah, there are bad guys. I think whether you would call, say, like me or Neal, good guys is a matter of perspective, because we might be good to some people, we might be bad to others. It's the same thing of bad guys, because people are ideologically aligned in different ways. It's not really a clear-cut concept. I think there are altruistic people who act in the interests of others, whether they like it or not. They're real, they're belligerent, they're really hard to deal with. And there are people who are just plain awful. I'm sort of reticent to sit and say there are good guys, because just it's a really loose definition of terms, isn't it? And this is the problem. There are people there are conversations that need to be had about what the greater good is, and that needs to be an all-encompassing conversation, really, because otherwise we just end up misdefining what's good and what's bad. It's complicated.
The sense of good and bad, we've been using this metaphor of the Wild West, and think about who made a good marshal back in the day. Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp. I mean, there's no black and white, just shades of gray.
It's a little bit like Young Guns too. I mean, Billy the Kid was an outlaw, but as he's played by Emilio Estevez, you quite like him. And that's the problem, isn't it? It is the Wild West. It's the Wild West all day, every day.
I think the big difference between that Wild West and this one is, in that one, there wasn't money flying around everywhere like there is now. I mean, no matter what this weaponized social media is used for, isn't the end goal the same in every circumstance? Isn't this all about money?
It's about money, it's about power, it's about chaos for the sake of chaos. What I think it's partly about is leveling playing fields, or perceived leveling of playing fields by people. So say a hostile nation state who faced years of sanctions worked out this would be a good way to get itself back on track. Taking it back to the Wild West, the key sort of difference here is that the West was won with a Colt 45, and now what we're dealing with is bullshit instead of bullets. It's much more dangerous.
And much more economical?
Oh, hell yeah. I mean, you can imagine say, for example, the cost of a tank. Neal, you got any ideas what the cost of a tank is for a good one? Not second hand.
Couple million.
Couple million for a tank. From the indictment which came out yesterday night from the Department of Justice for the lady who was the financial head of Concord, which was the internet research agency Troll Farms, we know that they managed to wage a disinformation warfare campaign between 2016 and June this year for 35 million quid, encompassing multiple countries, and only spending 10 million this year. So if you look at that versus the cost of equipping thousands of troops, bullets, uniforms, food, deployment, fuel costs, supply chain, logistics, weaponry,
casualties.
Yeah, it's phenomenally cheap. And the best thing is, and this goes back to Sun Tzu, one of the key things is, if you are going to take a territory, why would you want to destroy it first? You want it intact because you want to be able to strip the resources from it, the resources that you require. So actually, not only is this cheaper upfront, but the longer term costs of fighting wars this way are far outweighed by the benefits, because then everything is still there, it's still ripe, it's intact, you can take it, you can control it. And it's by this method that you can easily sort of install managed democracies, which, if you look at the sort of Putin model of Russia, it's a charade of a democracy. which has an oligarch at its head. And actually you can replicate that model, and you can look at America and you could say that of Trump, all the people behind his campaign, you're talking sort of billionaires. You could look at Brexit and you could apply the same logic there, because it's all about a figure who is very, very rich in a control position. And that's exactly what this type of warfare is. It's just cheaper. It's just cheaper. It's more effective, and you can roll over and you can cement a win without people even knowing that a war has been fought.
That, I think, is the big deal.
I think about 20 minutes ago, we crossed the point where I, given the nature of the audience for this show, I opened up my Kindle app as I'm sitting here. And I wanted to share some long-form reading recommendations for those who are listening to this and struggling to get their head around what it means. Bruce Sterling published Distraction, a political thriller, back in 1998. And I have found this book to be essentially prophetic. It has in advance described so many of the things that we saw with Arab Spring, with Occupy, with Black Lives Matter. It is prescient. Another set of books that are good to read if you're into fiction and trying to get a better sense of what's going on. The latest William Gibson trilogy of Zero History, Spook Country, and Pattern Recognition. And there's a follow-up now. Only the first of the three is out, called The Peripheral. It gives you a very accessible Gibsonian view on how things will work. And it's not focused on the technology. It's not focused on how we got to the technology. It's just there, and the social implications of it are explored. You know, that's his entire thrust of his writing career, has been, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. It's a fairly famous quote from him. Those books that I just rattled off are a way to maybe digest what we've been talking about here in a different and somewhat slower format.
I make absolutely clear I'm not here for this purpose, but if people want to try and get their head around large parts of what I'm saying, they could do a lot worse than reading the unabridged edition of Alternative War, which kind of takes everybody from an accidental trip to Sweden due to disinformation being picked up on social media on a sort of journey all the way through to the indictment of the Internet Research Agency trolls. And it incorporates Brexit, and it looks at concepts like managed democracy and explores Ukraine as a testbed area. But some of these broader concepts are quite neatly explained in there, or at least I think they are. In particular, the one about wars being fought before people have even noticed, which is really the reason that I wrote that, is because I found out and was shocked by it. It pulled what is effectively an intelligence product together and just wanted it out in the world so that people could at least have a base level of understanding of where we are now and how we've got there. And that's, again, without going into massively technical language. It's a good jumping off point for anyone who's scrabbling around going, what is this British guy talking about?
Absolutely, you are correct, James, and that's why, listeners, you look at the bottom of the show page and you'll see a link to Alternative War. Copy paste, you're there.
Thank you.
No problem.
So I read the book, and it is excellent and accessible.
Yep.
It is, anyone who's going to sit down and read a 200-page book will find everything in there. You know, it's a detective story. It's an adventure. And I am known for writing things that aren't particularly accessible, about things that require a lot of knowledge to get under. And we blazed by this point a while back. You mentioned what the condition of our military, of our law enforcement is in terms of responding to this. And there's some guys I know who are at the Joint Information Operations Warfare Center Command. And there is a book that is by one of the guys who's now out and is in DC and does policy-related stuff. His name is Howard Gambrell Clark, and the title is Information Warfare, Lost Tradecraft. And this is a not particularly heavy book. It's full of quotable quotes. You know, there are listeners here that are trying to develop coursework in this area. An excellent companion to Alternative War, which is a narrative.
See, I like reading the big dry documents. So my recommendation would be that people go back as far as the NATO capstone concept document, and their first sort of like forays into trying to define hybrid warfare. They're dry reads, but they're actually really, really neatly written, and they really manage to capture the asymmetric nature of warfare and also its coming battlefronts. So climate change is going to be one, because that is actually going to change territory and migratory patterns. So this is actual future stuff, which is becoming realer by the day and ties into everything that we've been talking about. So if people want to get up to speed and perhaps rather than go over ground which has passed, start looking at what comes next, they're not bad starting places.
It seems like it's time for my public service announcement. Hear the phrase, the Gerasimov Doctrine. And Gerasimov is the Russian equivalent of Mad Dog Mattis. It's like the head of their defense. He has published some thinking on, you know, what the Russian view of what we're calling hybrid warfare, alternative war. And that's not a Russian thing. That particular phrase was coined by a British author, Mark Galeotti, and he came out literally maybe 9 months ago, and said, you know, I made up the Gerasimov Doctrine just as a title for a blog post, and it's become a thing, and it's not really a thing, and please don't do it anymore.
Can I just point out, I have never quoted it because I thought it was bollocks.
I came across it and I found an article explaining, you know, getting Gerasimov right, which maybe it has, it was, I forget, it's in my slide share, I forget the source of it, but so the title might have been bollocks, but the content was good quality. And, but that labeling is incorrect. And there is a fundamental difference in view. You know, the West, we have Cybercom. It's a standalone command. It recently got elevated to a joint command at the same level as, you know, like our transport command or special forces. It's at the very pinnacle. And if you look at the Russian documentation, they have hard cyber, operations technical, you know, the intrusion, the bits and bytes, and then the human factors or operations psychological. There isn't a Russian cybercom. Everybody has that in every branch. They start teaching kids computers and, you know, with a focus on intrusion that you know, they can do things. There's a permission to explore there that is a matter of policy starting at age 12 that was, you know, or is similar to what we did have in spirit with the phone system and, you know, the early internet back in the 70s. So they are, as a society, Russia has put the pipeline in place to train the young people to do what's needed. And, you know, here on, you know, the West Pole of the world, we have the exact opposite with, you know, Title 18, Section 1030, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which tremendously punishes anyone who has the wits to do something unexpected and effective. It's a weird dichotomy that America has the most authoritarian law in that area, and Russia, which is actually authoritarian, has very much a Wild West free spirit kind of approach on what we refer to as cyber issues.
I think that there's an interesting thing there. It's not the first time that Russia has used that as a model. There's a very, very interesting lady that I met when I was talking at the Byline Festival this year, and I'm going to be interviewing her for a film that I'm making. But she grew up in Russia, and she showed an aptitude for English. So she was put on a basically compulsory course, which is what they used to give to anyone with proficiency, which taught them how to actively engage in disruptive behavior. So it's sort of a natural extension that as the online world has become a real thing, that the logical step was to encourage the groundwork for national domestic Russian network of, I'm sure Putin called them patriotic hackers at some point, didn't he? So the groundwork's already always been there. The sort of social modeling has always been very different, but very effective.
Now, what we've seen with the attainability and accessibility to this type of data collection and opinion manipulation, where have we seen it moving in physically and remaining operative? Even if things get shut down, there's always a new contract to sign, it seems. How do they maintain their influence?
I think like a really, really clear and up-to-the-minute example can come from the latest indictment of the people at Concord, which is the Internet Research Agency and the other linked agencies. So the St. Petersburg troll farm. We know that the GRU hacked the DNC. We know that that data was then leaked out. We know that the internet trolls then pushed that information into the social media sphere, subsequently into the media, because the media is moving towards this viral sort of model where it uses social media to create its own news, to feed its own cycle. So you have an event, you have some actual data, you then have the trolls are deployed, and their job is to just signal amplify this story and drive it into the timelines of the target population. So as a practical deployment, we know that they spent 25 million in the period up to 2017, and they targeted not just the 2016 election, but the topics which have come up since. So Charlottesville, so Take a Knee, all of this stuff. And we know that they've targeted stuff up to June 2018. The way that a deployment works, and if you take the first-hand accounts of some of the people who've worked in the Olgino troll farms, they're sort of very low-level operators. They're given some social media accounts and given some tasking. Some of them make memes. Some of them are just there to push news out. But it's all set to strategic objectives, which obviously are coming in via the Kremlin. So what you do, if you wanted to impact Hillary Clinton's election chances, you know you've got leaked data, data leak gets organized, data leak goes out, you've got targeting data, because obviously we know that it wasn't just emails which were nicked, it was the actual DNC core voter base as well, wasn't it? So you've got targeting data there. The trolls are then tasked to go out and make sure that these people see it. And they just work office hours in teams, bundling away in these little troll farms. And it's just about visibility. It doesn't even matter if people believe it, as long as the information flashes up and is taken in. So they report back and say, right, we've done this many tweets and this many things. And then they review what's working and what's trending. And if you look at things like the Hamilton dashboard, it will tell you what the current trending troll topics are for a monitored group of pro-Kremlin accounts. And it's a really, really simple deployment mechanism. And even when it was shut down, so say, for example, now we know that the GRU did the hack and leaked the emails and that it was pushed by trolls. It doesn't change anything because that election result stands. So the damage is done 2 years down the line. And then in terms of what they can do, they can step back in at any moment, because shutting down a building or shutting down an organization or charging 13 people that are never going to be extradited to face trial in your country is completely irrelevant. It doesn't take away the problem at all. Why were they targeting Take a Knee as a hashtag? Is that a strictly political thing, or is that a societal thing? So what it's about is, earlier on, I think when everything was cutting out, I was explaining that once you have a core base who will do as, no matter how crazy the things you do, they will stick with you. And say in Trump's case, that sticks around the 40% mark for the GOP. 60% of the rest of the population, 20% are hardcore Democrats. Everybody else is in subgroups which are pliable, which are divisible, in which you can create chaos. And if you look at the distribution of things that the trolls have targeted, they're actually targeting that portion. They're targeting these groups, not to steer politics generally, like they did with the big DNC leak, but actually to prevent unity. And that's the that's the key thing. That's the key function. Because if that larger proportion of the population can't unite to vote against the solid base, then it can't be reversed. It's actually really, really simple. What Russia does is really, really brutally simple. There's no big confusion or big secret about it. They like you to know what they've done because it's part of the boast. The worst people to have a fight with are the kind of people that want to leave you with a scar.
Well, I guess from an internet parlance, it would be we're pawned.
I guess so, yeah. I'm not really down with the kids on all this stuff. You'd have to speak to my 9-year-old boy. But yeah, it would be exactly that.
So Neal, from the way this shit flies around the world side of it, is it really that easy to pull off if you have the right data sets and a little bit of money?
Well, I'm calculating here what I can and can't answer. What I can and can't answer in public. There are a lot of influence operations that go on. The troll farm stuff that that's been described it's a carrier wave. It's always present. It becomes the normal flow of information. The pace is like a hypnotist. It's overwhelming. It's meant to keep you a little bit off balance. And then when they need to drop a certain message in, they do so. I think this is something we saw demonstrated with Silence is Consent and the radicalization of the Caesar Sayoc. There's a steady flow of conservative news there, conspiratorial conservative news. And then at regular intervals, there's injections of unrelated or apolitical violence, or violence that is political, but that is appropriate for a lone wolf actor. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. And you don't need any money at all if you have the raw talent. I mean, think about the evil triumvirate of 4chan, Something Awful, and Encyclopedia Dramatica. There's people with, a couple web servers, a little bit of hosting, and some board and badly led in the sense that, psychopaths rise to the top because they produce the most entertaining fuckery. A badly led group of young men that can do astonishing things.
Do you remember when I did there's a little experiment I did at the very start of Liberty STRATCOM stuff, and it was called Love Bomb. I took that Twitter account at the time, which had 45 followers, and I tweaked and I messed around and I looked at some basic stuff. So content, just looked at basic marketing principles of colors and color meanings and stuff like that, and I designed a graphic. That account on its own, say like a tweet had an organic reach of about 80 people. With the right amount of tweaking and with the right amount of, without a data set, targeting into people and the right dark ads as well, for less than $20, I could push that 45 follower Twitter account to a reach for one tweet of almost 20,000 people. It is absolutely inexpensive that if you turned your mind to it, with or without a budget, that you could reach people with whatever message you wanted, designed in the right way for it to stay in their head.
Money matters a little bit. Talent and sense of what will be perceived as new and fresh is as important. And that's why those Chan kids do things the way they do. And, they have the successes they have.
That's why we have Milos.
That's why you have weaponized autism and Shia LaBeouf's flag in Tennessee gets replaced with a MAGA hat. That kind of collective action.
I think part of the establishment of the alt-right movement, the blame there lies partly with traditional media. As I said earlier on, that they've struggled to adapt to this viral-led marketplace. We went through this period where decent outlets were profiling these people and talking about them in positive language and actually turning them into celebrities. So that was just traditional media coverage, which has effectively smashed the Overton window and turned the unthinkable into the thinkable just because it was desperate for readership. So there's a lot more complexity to that, and that's without even going into sponsorship and design and careful campaign management, which are also issues in the sort of the alt-right celebrity sphere. So Neal's kind of bang on right that what the Chan kids do is something else entirely, and it's very, very clever.
Boredom is the mother of invention. with the with people who are born with internet. I think that's becoming more and more clear. Everybody should know that by now. I hope it still scares the right agencies. I'm not sure if it does anymore, or they're just convinced they can ramp up recruiting and capture that market. I think they also have another method of recruitment. It's not as voluntary, but we don't need to go into that. Okay, like you said, this account that you took from 40-some and then you had a reach of 20,000, if you're looking to find the people you need to find, it seems amazingly easy to me. And it's much more preferable because you know what your target is. You're not looking for your target. So if that kind of exponential reach can be achieved, even though it's a small group, I mean, 20,000 on Twitter is nothing. But it depends who that 20,000 is. So how does the platform respond to these micro bugs?
Twitter's response, as I said at the very beginning, and it was kind of crucial, that as long as platforms are based around a model where usership equates to revenue, we're always going to have a problem. And the platforms themselves have shown a degree of resistance to scrutiny at state level, which has been a little bit disturbing because they resisted the Senate inquiry. Do you remember that originally it was kind of like, oh no, there's 100 Twitter accounts. Oh no, there's 400 Twitter accounts. Oh no, there's 2,000 Twitter accounts. Oh no, there's 4,000 Twitter accounts. We've decided now it's 4,000 Twitter accounts. There was a big long thread which a Twitter researcher put out today, and basically it was, how do I describe it? It's by a researcher for Twitter, and I've summarized it quite neatly. But basically, it's a thread in which they say that they get rid of most bots before people see bots, but they've researched the bots that people have seen, and they've facilitated the research of the bots people have seen by other researchers. But people don't really see bots unless Twitter says that they've seen bots. So what they've done to resolve it is they've added a new bot reporting function for the bots that we see.
And they don't.
Well, this is the thing. It's not a solution, is it? Because what they've effectively done is they've said there's only a problem if we say that there's a problem, and you're not really seeing bots because we take them out first. But then they're admitting that there are a sufficient number of bots present for them to be researched and to justify the invention of new tools for reporting. So what they're actually doing is defending their revenue model, because if they admit that they have a problem and that their user numbers are fake, then they could find themselves on the end of a lawsuit, as Facebook just has. So there's going to have to be discussions at a state level, I think, which are going to have to take some of this stuff out of the hands of the platforms themselves. Germany pulled an absolute blinder when they changed the online hate speech rules, and Twitter had to suddenly put Germany in a box, which proves that actually it is completely possible. So that this wild west is almost artificial.
This confirms what I was saying earlier, that you have to have the right meat to machine ratio. So Twitter purchased Smite in June, and they kicked out 70 million automated accounts. And then a month later, they canceled 143,000 applications, and which were being used for spamming, for automation. And there have been other policy changes that they've made, like your application can only do so much activity. You know, they've put in not per user limits, but per application limits. And so unless you have an actual app that's in the app store that people are using, that's doing something innovative, you don't have any traction to do things. And so that excludes people like me. I mean, I could have written a bot. I used to do stuff like that. It used to be that you'd put up a political campaign bot, and you would want it to wake up in the morning for the people in, wherever the district was, and then, get quiet after a little burst around dinner time and not say anything overnight, and, talk once or twice an hour, and very transparently be doing whatever it was supposed to be doing, but just, being, like a station identification sort of thing. And that's gone. If you want to game Twitter now, you've got to have a system where you can provision large numbers of virtual Windows machines and make them look legitimate and have them do what's needed. And then there are click farms. If you look forget which trade rag does it the most, but like every month there's a picture of what looks like a display rack full of iPhones or Androids, and it's usually in Thailand. And they'll bust guys in an apartment with 600 phones on one power strip, and they've got a shoebox with 40,000 SIM cards in it, and they're doing something, and there's some sort of automation software on the phone. So the requirements for what is automation have, that game has been changed dramatically, and it puts the grassroots players out of that business, and it leaves more room for the big fish.
Which is exactly how they like it.
And the revenue aspect of it, this is another thing. The key performance indicator, number of active users per month, and those bots are driving outrage, and outrage generates clicks. And it keeps people engaged, and people are, there's a calculated, how do we get people addicted to this environment? We haven't talked at all about social media addiction, and, it's very much similar to, neurologically, I think, similar to gambling addiction.
I think there's some of the recent studies in particular on the impact on children. They're quite fascinating, and actually it's sort of achieving complete psychological behavioral changes in people. It's an understudied area, I would suggest, because it's relatively new and the pace of change has been so quick. But academia as well as policy has got quite a lot of work to do. It's just a matter of whether it's too late for the public to be informed in the same way that they once were.
Like the tobacco industry and the lobbying that they did. Only now the entity that has to do the lobbying is also the vehicle used to do the lobbying. So how do you put a stop to that? And I think that I'm playing with my Fitbit on my wrist as we're talking here, and thinking that the appropriate way to handle this is only so much access credit per physical activity, and the people who can maintain that discipline are going to be physically healthier and mentally healthier.
I think some of the interesting stuff that came out of the work that we've just done on Scotland and Scottish social media is that actually at the heart of it, there are solutions at a policy level, but part of the answer is empowering people to better manage their online lives, which is basically, we were commissioned to do some work by a member of the European Parliament for Scotland to look at social media and see about scale of problem. And in the course of that, we've managed to sort of separate benign automated accounts from malign accounts. So sort of hostile activity from non-hostile. So non-hostile would be porn bots and stuff like that, and advertising accounts. But when we got to solutions, what we looked at was actual ways of changing the types of conversation and giving people more power to decide whether or not to engage in conversations, which is where I think the future needs to be. So the upshot of a couple of these things was that we made a suggestion that if we wanted people to be secure that they were talking to people in their own native environment, that Twitter should actually actively take over the geolocations. So you can't self-select and say that I am in Texas. It would be put there for you. And if you're not, then it would be an automatic red flag that you're not talking to someone who is confirmed as being there. The other thing that we sort of put forward as a suggestion, which seems to have gone down really well, is this concept of linking a profile to state identity in exchange for a verified status. So that's a project for a platform and a government to engage in. But the caveat to that is you don't have to give away anonymity, because you can still have whatever handle name you would like. It just means that behind the scenes you are accountable for your actions. So if you were to do something on Scottish social media which broke the law in Scotland, even if your account was outwardly anonymous, you could be held to account for your own actions, which is something which is really important. I actually think that those are the kind of suggestions which are going to be taken up. And then in terms of empowering people themselves to better manage their own conversations and who they engage with, we ended up developing something called Scott or Bot, which is a website, and it gives people ready access to a number of different tools which can help them identify whether the account they're dealing with is a bot or a troll or a real person. And it's a staged process, and within the report we established failure rates for some of the best known sort of bot detectors that are out there. So we developed a multiple stage process, and it allows people to do their own investigative assessment of who they're talking to. And if we could get people perhaps more into the habit of going through a vetting program, and the results so far have been quite positive, I think we could actually tone down the negative impact of a lot of the hostile operations on social media.
It's amazing that he went through nearly 5 minutes of that and didn't say the word blockchain, because there are endless proposals out there for accountable, but your identity is opaque unless you screw up. For Twitter, I think it is a revenue source if people are, they're going to, verified American, verified Scot, whatever. That's a $4.99 or $7.99 or $10.99 a year kind of thing. But there's an access issue, because that's a lot of money in a place like Ghana as opposed to the West, so that there's a need for inclusion. I think that the geolocation that you describe is probably not, that's going to have to be a slider, and people will say choose to not disclose at one end, and at the other end, probably no closer than city per Twitter. And then the people that really want to play Foursquare and, become the mayor of their local coffee shop can continue to do so. But most people are going to be allergic to that level of targeting.
So I think the simple answer in that case is you're not allowed to have a location, and then people just make up their own minds as to whether or not they want to speak to you. Because I think one of the key things which has become clear is with the fake accounts pretending to be in certain places and influencing news in certain places, part of the key psychology of that has been convincing people they are local. And actually, if you could take a bullet out of the gun, there's absolutely no harm. Because I think what we sort of need to acknowledge is that if we're dealing with a weapon system and it's aimed at civilians, anything that we can do which gives them a fighting chance is just a sensible step forwards. But these are the conversations that need to be being had at the policy level that we talked about earlier on, that isn't necessarily grasping what the issue is in the first place.
Absolutely. And just this last week, here in North America on PBS, Frontline had a two-parter about a lot of things we're talking about. What I remember from it is they had a quote from Wael Ghonim. Now, anybody who remembers Tahrir Square should remember who he is. If they saw his picture, they certainly would know who he is. He had a very short statement. That's true, and he found out the hard way. Social media rewards tribalism. And I think that's behind all the attempts to appear native to whatever the target is. And obviously, James, from this work that's been undertaken in Scotland, it wasn't on a lark, right? You knew there was something wrong and something had to be analyzed, right?
Yeah. No, it's a very, very real, significant problem.
What I'm saying is it was a reaction to something you were seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, the MEP who commissioned the work and his colleagues and myself as an observer and Neal and even Scottish people themselves who are engaged social media users are all massively aware that there is this problem. So it wasn't a fishing expedition. It was in response to a specific thing.
Now, the reason I ask is because I want to read the first paragraph of Chapter 13 of Alternative War, because this is where you've been, and this is why you have the insight that you do. It was only weeks since Sweden, but sitting back, I knew the far right had aligned internationally, working in a complex network to undermine democracy and the stability of Western powers. Collaborating across multiple fronts, they were deploying state-of-the-art techniques to hack data, emotionally control electorates, and spread disinformation. Over a period of years, they had gained control of political discourse and subsequently beneficial economic outputs through an almost indecipherable maze of personal and company connections. Seeing it all come together was like watching a slow-motion car crash, and the situation was exacerbated by a dawning realization. All of this raised more questions than it answered, especially when the changing face of terrorism was considered. The greatest unanswered question which leapt out at me was, has this global operation also played an active role in terror attacks aimed at the democracies they are targeting? There is still no firm answer, but the red flags were up. That's something I really, really question. This is the Wild West. We've established that in agreement. What's to prevent going too far?
Nothing.
That's the truth. There is nothing.
And that's just collateral damage, or we didn't think of that, or it's too late?
It is too late. It's the problem, isn't it, when you take the genie out of the bottle or you open Pandora's box, everything comes flying out, and then what are you left with? I don't think this can be put back in its box at the moment. I don't see how it can be. And actually, if you track the ongoing impact of that interwoven network across even Europe, you can actually see it's gaining traction rather than losing it. So since I wrote that, obviously, Italy has tipped over. You saw massive gains by the AfD in Germany, which is completely unthinkable. Mm-hmm. Sweden itself, and I can't see where this is going to stop.
We did a study of Sweden's election as it happened, and the bot-backed group looked very big, but didn't get a lot of traction. And I got a lot of Swedish followers out of that.
It was the Alternative for Sweden versus the Sweden Democrats, which are the primary party, wasn't it? The Sweden Democrats made huge gains, are occupying a position in the Riksdag which they never could have dreamed of years ago. And actually, part of me thinks that the reason for the existence of the smaller Alternative for Sweden party is actually support as opposed to competition, because they're fundamentally spreading the same messages.
A stalking horse. They don't have to win, they just have to shift the Overton window for Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the whole thing, because the Sweden Democrats, by comparison to them, look relatively normal. So that's exactly what it is. It's a push down the Overton window. And I think if we were to perhaps take a closer look at some of the other areas, because in Alternative War, I talked about the Five-Star Movement in Italy, and then obviously the Lega Nord made gains as well. So it's all about normalization. I think if we were to perhaps spend a little bit of focus or look at some control group activity, and this is something that policymakers and interested listeners could perhaps get stuck into, is looking for the stalking horses and seeing how, in the grander scheme of things, they interact, because that's an area which I don't think we've had capacity necessarily to deal with.
So there's a couple things there that you just said. To translate it to the native vernacular, geopolitical edgelord collective to describe the alternative for Sweden. And that was, I'm sure, the small subset of Glenn's audience are now laughing themselves silly. And the other thing is that, we've talked about the Alternative War book, and we haven't talked a lot about what the net war system itself can do. So we've done studies in Scotland and Sweden where it's been, largely me that, James gives the targeting, I go out and I, do whatever I do, and I, come back and we can harvest 5 or 10 or 20,000 accounts and assess what's going on with them. But that system was built. I mean, it had its first outing back in 2013 and 2014, and it was used against a domestic right-wing problem here in the U.S. And then the Terrorism Research and Analysis Consortium took it out with a group of a dozen people and ran it against ISIS in 2014, 2015, a little bit in 2016. And it's built to have teams come on it. There are so many of these machine learning projects out there where there's a white paper and they've got a PhD and they're talking about the algorithms they use and the hardware they need. And it's a black box. You plug it into the Twitter API or GNIP or whatever on one end, and then it spits out answers on the other. And the human factor is not there.
That's the key difference in what we do, isn't it?
Yeah. If we had a need to set up sort of a citizens patrol for Scotland, and we had a dozen interested parties that were willing to sign up and keep occasional watch on their phones, and just point out when there's something that looks odd.
Twitter mods?
Yeah. Well, anything. We reach for Twitter first because it's the easiest to program and it's the fastest moving. I mean, Twitter's the native data network for humans. Computers get packets, humans get tweets. It's with Twitter, you start with Twitter as a foundation. You can build any other information service.
I think the other key thing about Twitter is that actually tweets drive news media content, whereas Facebook content doesn't. Facebook reads the news and interprets the news badly very often, but tweets themselves become news that enters the news cycle and then feeds it. So as actually it's almost like the infection vector. If you were to think of this whole thing as sort of malware for humans or a disease, that's where you catch the cold, and that's fundamentally where you can prevent the cold as well.
The last time our species faced something that was this ubiquitous and this disruptive was probably about 8,000 years ago with alcohol. Because you look at what's happened to the Native American population who had no experience with alcohol, genetically. And while in Europe and in Asia, the alcoholics have been breeding themselves out of existence for the last 400 generations, the Native Americans didn't have that. And now we are globally, all at once, testing something that is highly addictive against every demographic that has telecommunications. And, that's unprecedented. The last time it happened, it unfolded over, however long it takes for a technology like brewing beer to start, wherever it started in the Mideast or, the Balkans and spread regionally. Now those kind of things can spread globally in, a matter of seconds.
But this one makes everybody that matters so much money. That's why, isn't that the difference? Back then, there wasn't really the capability to stop it once it got rolling. Now, there's no money in stopping it.
I think this is the big problem, and this is why I keep sort of banging on that the intervention needs to be at state level. Because if I even dare to dream for a minute what me and Neal would be able to achieve with a moderate level of state funding, we'd actually be stepping into preventative as opposed to reactive in a very short space of time. So yeah, it all does revolve around money, and there's this conflict, isn't there, between public and private interest, and I'm not sure how we transcend that.
Well, it's been my intent to have an academic license, and once you get this sort of conflict, is going to become an issue. I mean, it's something that I think tends to fall into marketing. That's the discipline that would get it now, but it's going to become an issue for criminal justice programs and for whatever the Masters in Public Policy program is going to have this kind of thing.
I remember back in 2006 trying to convince my superior officers that the British legal system needed to redefine the age-old definition of public place for the sake of the Public Order Act to incorporate the internet. It fell on deaf ears and probably still would. So yeah, there needs to be a massive reshaping of everything.
What I see the biggest difficult factor in that, since apparently being humane doesn't matter, common sense doesn't matter, somehow it's going to have to be the same way that in some places some sort of carbon tax is being sold, because still there has to be money moving around for us to even try to do anything better. I just think in this day and age, especially in the United States, the lobbies control what's law and what's not law. How long is it before every time it'll be like almost the White House press conference? Send Twitter a question, they'll say, hey, it's still a free platform. That's all they're going to have left, because, like you said, they're all about shareholder value, market share. The way the internet is set up and the way these social media platforms are set up, isn't this a perfect storm for this type of warfare?
It makes the communicable move very, very, very swiftly. And a revolution in human affairs would be if we actually did what I predicted was going to happen in March of 2009. I wrote an article entitled Social Media's Federated Future. I think I mentioned this early on in the program, that what Mastodon is doing is sort of what I thought would happen quickly. And if people truly get fed up, there may be a transition there, but it's complex. If you think about it, there are these protest apps where you end up with phone-to-phone comms. If the cell's out, they can talk to each other over Bluetooth. And if you think about what the world will be like with supply chain interruptions, we'll end up more like, the usage patterns that you see in the Horn of Africa, as opposed to the West, where you have, some people have access and it's used to do important things so that the scarcity would return. Because right now we have this instant on, copy everything, Moore's law, constantly increasing computing power. And those things, the supply chains are going to break sooner or later.
But we'll get every dime we can before that happens.
Yeah. There, that a poverty of vision. The ones who are acting that way can't imagine that it would work any differently, or don't care that would happen. One of the sharpest thinkers on this, John Robb, another guy that you ought to endeavor to get on your show.
There's one other quote from what Frontline did, and this came from Nathaniel Gleischer, who is the head of security for Facebook globally. But he said on camera, "This isn't a problem you can solve. It's a problem you can contain." Is that accurate? Or does that reveal that there's always a business side? Like, if you think we're going to turn all this cash down, you're fucking crazy.
Epidemiology. That's the word that jumps to mind. He says you can contain it, you can't solve it. And like who you vaccinate, you don't have to get 100% of the population, just the people that travel, and then you can interdict the disease. It's similar, I think, is probably what he was trying to get at.
I'd take the more sort of brutal view that you can solve it. I don't see how it can be contained without a significant number of complex interventions at an international level. Sometimes the easiest way to solve a problem is to do the most direct thing that you possibly can. And increasingly, as I've been on the journey that I've been on, I just think that the most striking thing that anyone can do would be to power it down.
But you can't, fiduciary responsibility that Twitter has. They're not going to do that. Their mode is going to be to reduce the overt bots and, like we're seeing, the more human activity, and let it roll. And it actually becomes a norm to have that kind of conflict.
Which I think, obviously, having a law enforcement background, one of the sort of the key principles is arrest, which just literally means to stop. And sometimes that can just be temporary. And at the moment, I believe that we're at a point where we've got a sufficient amount of evidence to tell us that we need to take a pause and a very, very deep breath. And the platforms aren't going to do that themselves. And it's looking increasingly like policy and lawmakers aren't going to do this themselves. So the only real option left is for people to perhaps contemplate the need to power down for a little bit, because without the genuine users, the platforms are worthless in terms of revenue, and perhaps there's the necessity for some kind of global power down movement to send a message, and this is something which is doable and achievable. It's like pick an arbitrary day of the week, it's like a Wednesday, where protesters don't engage with their social media. The absence will be felt and it will be noticed. And actually, if that could grow into a global movement and grow to multiple days until the remedy is put in place, then actually you can reintroduce the concept of sensible, impactful protest into this borderless Wild West. And perhaps that's just a little bit of food for thought. But yeah, I do think there is room for an actual protest movement within this as well. But that just depends on how passionately people feel about having their lives fucked with by people who are ultimately faceless.
The 21st century. Neal, do you know it's 2 years to the day that Twitter stole those 2 accounts off me? Assholes. So I was going to mention that anniversary, and then I was going to make a little statement/question about they're just going to keep changing the terms of service and the rules to whatever they say it is. Will they use that as something to help a return to normalcy, or use it to stifle it?
They'll use it for profit. And whether that is making things worse or making things better, that is the state intervention that JP keeps mentioning. They have to be regulated.
Yeah, they do. There's no other way around it.
They won't self-regulate.
There's no real incentive to do that. Well, this has been, as always, an outstanding episode for MMM Live on the 5. I would like to thank my guests, Neal Rauhauser and James Patrick. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, James, I hope you got to expand a bit off your 50-second hits on network. That was the whole idea.
Yeah, it's been incredibly useful. A lot of these concepts are narrowed down to sound bites, and I'm not sure that it sinks in that way.
Right on. And thank you, Neal, for basically suggesting the whole show. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. I'm going to head to bed.
All righty, there we go. My thanks to Neal Rauhauser and James Patrick. It's a lot of fun to put that together. I thought it was going to fit into 2 hours. Obviously, it did not. It was hard enough to trim it down to that, an engaging conversation. That's the view up here for MMM Live on the 5 this year. Thanks for listening. Next, the view up here will be November 14th. Thank you. Remember. Good night.